technology scares me. And so Chuck is not only giving our opening address this morning, he's keeping an eye on the technology. And for that, we are very appreciative. When Chuck came on and agreed to speak to us today, he agreed that he would take a look at that relationship between drainage out there in the field and how it affects the health and welfare of our lake. And this is something we're really struggling to make sure we get very straight and understand, because there really seems to be some need for some action from the field, and for us to become spokespersons in this regard. And for that to happen, we need to have understanding. And to get that understanding, we're really lucky to have Chuck. He has an honors master's degree in wildlife management. He's been around for a couple of decades managing lakes for, or rather, Ducks Unlimited programs. And I just want to say to him, thank you, Chuck, for all the work you've done. And we're looking forward to your words, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Lynn. Can you see my screen? Is the convention and AGM slide up?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. As Lynn mentioned, I am with Ducks Unlimited Canada. And today, PARCS has asked me to speak about Ducks Unlimited and wetlands and the benefits that those wetlands provide to resort communities and resort living. But before I get into that, as Lynn also did, I just want to acknowledge that we are here in Saskatchewan for this webinar this morning, that we are on treaty land, and these treaties govern our relationships with Indigenous peoples. We have come together today on treaty territory, and I acknowledge that this is the homeland also of the Métis and honor their contributions. It's important that we recognize that we all have benefited and we have responsibilities under these treaty agreements, and that we acknowledge the harms and injustice of the past and the present. So we dedicate our efforts to working together in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation. We are all treaty people. So as Lynn mentioned, my presentation today, I'm going to talk about wetlands and resort communities. And she's also asked me and the Parks Board to kind of review the previous webinars that Parks organized and held back in early spring called Lake Water Wednesdays. There was a series of webinars there, and I don't know if everyone participated in those, but they've asked me just to highlight some of the key findings of those, or some of the key discussion items. So I'll do that, and then I'll move into sort of the bulk of my presentation. So as I mentioned, there was a very successful series of 5 webinars called Lake Water Wednesdays. And if any of you missed them or want to watch them again, simply go on to Google or your search engine and look on YouTube. Google Provincial Association of Resort Communities, and you will find the videos there, and you can watch them at your convenience. So the first person that spoke was Dr. Pamela Martin on the water rights as pathways to sustainable development, and sort of water as having rights, or nature as having rights. And this was a bit of a different discussion, definitely a different topic for probably a lot of people. She highlighted the fact that we've lost about 70% of our wetlands, and this concept that ecosystems, just like human beings, have the right to exist and thrive. And so she focused on the goals of the United Nations for sustainable development, and talked about forming these guardianship bodies that allow people to speak up for nature and defend nature when nature can't defend itself. And she had plenty of examples from all over the world, including the US and even in Canada, in Quebec. And basically the process was a way of creating legal mechanisms that allow people to defend nature and give nature rights. And she ended by saying, what about your local lake or your area wetlands? Are they protected? Are there limits to development? And who is involved in making those decisions when development occurs? So again, you can watch her presentation on YouTube. The next speaker was Dr. Peter Levitt, and he spoke about water quality in Saskatchewan. He has studied, working with the University of Regina, has studied water quality in Saskatchewan for over 30 years. And his work looking at past and present water quality samples, he's able to look at sort of what water quality was like in the past, as well as the present, and then also use that to sort of forecast the future. He indicated that, you know, at one time, wastewater was the big problem in Saskatchewan. That was contributing a lot of the nutrients to our lakes. But in recent decades, we've seen a shift, and that some of the largest contributors in Saskatchewan are due to non-point sources, such as agricultural runoff. He also indicated that his research is showing that blue-green algae blooms are showing up earlier, lasting longer, and that the biotoxins produced by blue-green algae are dangerous to livestock and pets and humans as well, and that we can only expect these algae blooms to get worse with climate change. So this was one of his slides, just showing, you know, over time and by measuring algae in the sediments, they're able to determine water quality. And you can see that, you know, things have changed substantially over time. And also just even with the same levels of blue-green or with algae, increasing temperatures causes increased algae blooms. So definitely not a good thing to be happening. We're getting sort of a double whammy in terms of increasing nutrient loading and then the added impacts of climate change. And then he went over some of the threats, such as invasive species, water management. He cited the Quill Lakes flood as being one, and how that lake has been affected by agricultural drainage, as well as high precipitation, and then plans to divert that water into another water body, and the concerns over salinity there. So, and then also solution mines and fracking were sort of the other big ones. Next up was Jerry Geiger. She is the province's invasive species coordinator, and she went through some of the actions that they've done to keep invasive species out of the province. I know most people probably are well aware of zebra mussels and some about Prussian carp, but there are some 25 species or more in Saskatchewan, or could be threats to Saskatchewan. So she talked about the programs they've developed, and I know PARCS has been very active in that. She talked about some of the close calls they had with zebra mussels coming in to Canada in mossballs this year for the aquarium trade, and then also that she's worked to educate and enlist and train some of the other staff in the province, border officers and conservation officers. Just highlighting some of her slides. So yeah, why are we concerned? Impacts to recreation and native species and habitat. Something to be very concerned about, and that we're early on in the stage of the invasive curve, and hopefully we can stay there by sticking in that prevention measure, because as we get up over time into long-term management, the costs and the impacts are substantial. Next up, they had Joe Joza, sorry. He's a retired park planner, and talked about building expectations about environmental protection and protecting lake shores into your community plans. And so he says, sustainable development not only meets the needs of the people today, but also in the future. And so you need to look at your plans when you're developing them. And he talked about how you do that, and dedicating lands for non-development, and making sure that some of those open spaces remain protected, and those things continue to thrive within your zoning bylaws. And then the last presentation webinar consisted of 3 people. It was sort of a panel discussion about water and stewardship and farmland drainage. And the first presenter of the panel was Bob Halliday, and Bob is a professional engineer. And he's talked about the prairie hydrology, including some of the water management issues and how water flows across the province. And this idea that even though Saskatchewan, you know, has a very diverse landscape, much of it is connected through our waterways and how the systems of dams and dikes and rivers that we manage, and how we manage water and how it moves across this province. And that has a big effect on everybody. He talked about how lots of parts of Saskatchewan really don't contribute water to other parts, and how water management can be a challenge. This was one slide that he pulled up that is worth noting. And this is a map that shows the contributing area in Saskatchewan. So when you think of runoff, so when water falls as rain or snow and the snow melts, that water flows off the land somewhere. And this map shows the area in red that when that happens, it basically doesn't go anywhere. Most of Saskatchewan is what they call non-contributing. So that water doesn't make it to major river systems and flow out of the province. So what we have in Saskatchewan basically stays in Saskatchewan. And that's due primarily to our prairie pothole terrain, all those little sloughs and marshes that we see everywhere. That's what is holding all this water on the landscape. And then he talked about, you know, how that affects your recreational lakes. Who's responsible? The Water Security Agency in the province and also Ministry of Environment play a role. You know, are there structures? Who looks after those? Who's responsible for those? And then some of the challenges with, again, point and non-point source pollution. We also had Alice Davies give a presentation. She's with the Lower Qu'Appelle Watershed Stewards, and she manages that the stewards there, and looking after the Lower Qu'Appelle along with the other 6 recreational lakes all the way from the Craven Dam to the Manitoba border, and highlighted that, yeah, we do all live in a watershed. Anything that happens in that watershed affects everyone else in the watershed, and talked about some of the challenges she's facing in her watershed and working with the people in that watershed to try to make the watershed more environmentally friendly and healthier for everyone. Talked about the impacts from nutrients from both non and non-point source, and that we can't take our water for granted. Just a slide showing where the Lower Qu'Appelle watershed is in Saskatchewan. Not all watersheds in Saskatchewan have watershed stewardship organizations, but many do. In terms of their watershed, the Lower Qu'Appelle, they started off with some baseline studies, and hopefully over time can improve the state of the watershed. But as you can see, a lot of their aspects of their watershed are stressed. And the other thing she talked about was nutrients and how does drainage release nutrients. So this is farmland drainage. So this concept that what happens is under normal situations, when the snow melts, the water all flows into wetlands normally, or runs off the land. And so it carries with it phosphorus. Phosphorus, unlike other nutrients, it's in solution in the water, and it flows with the water off the land and collects in a wetland. Where farmland drainage comes into play is if there's a drain, that phosphorus doesn't stay in that wetland, but it then drains out and moves with the water downstream and ends up in lakes and rivers, which can lead to algae blooms. And so it has the unintended consequence of releasing nutrients into our waterways. And this is just a highlight of the study that they completed back in starting in 2017, a 3-year study where they looked at nutrients in all the major parts of the watershed in the creeks. And as you can see, the black lines represent non-point sources. So those are things that, such as agricultural runoff, and point sources or municipal sources where they can actually measure, say the water coming out of the Regina wastewater treatment plant. And as you can see, the vast majority of the lines are black, meaning that much of the nutrients going into the Qu'Appelle system are not from wastewater and town lagoons. Previous to this, most people thought that most of the nutrients were coming from cities and towns, and that's in the case of the Qu'Appelle watershed, that's not necessarily the case. And worth noting also is this study was done before Regina upgraded their wastewater treatment plant. So, the city of Regina would have even less impact on Wascana Creek now, given what they've done there. And lastly, the last person to speak was Jeff Olson. Jeff's he's the founding member and chair of the Citizens Environmental Alliance. He's also a former conservation officer and watershed planner with the Water Security Agency. And he spoke about the important roles that wetlands play in filtering and cleansing runoff into our lakes, and what impacts we see when we lose wetlands to farmland drainage, and the need for a provincial wetland policy. Because as of now, even though Saskatchewan has a drainage policy, we don't have a wetland policy that protects wetlands and the benefits that they provide. So some of the highlights from his presentation included the amount of drainage in Saskatchewan, how farmland drainage impacts watersheds and impacts resort communities, and this need to have a wetland protection policy. It's just some of the highlights of his slides. So an estimated 1.6 to 2.4 million acres of drainage are in this province, unapproved, meaning they don't have a license from the Water Security Agency. About 1,800 miles of organized drainage. So there is a long history in Saskatchewan of producers organizing drainage projects to better access farmland and grow crops. So there's also legal drainage, and so all those have impacts downstream and on resort villages. And the other takeaway was that the vast majority of drainage works in this province are unapproved. 95 to 99% are unapproved or illegal, meaning they don't have a license from the Water Security Agency, meaning they may not meet all the proper construction approvals and things like that. So definitely we have some work to do ahead of us in getting our drainage done more responsibly. Why be concerned about drainage, farmland drainage? Well, we all care about our water and the wildlife, fish and wildlife, and because we live in a watershed, water moves, downstream. And as Alice pointed out, that water from drainage makes it into our lakes and rivers, and so it affects how our water quality is. Affects the nutrients in our water and how materials are transported downstream. And this was just a slide he showed showing kind of farmland drainage here in the upper right. You can see how all the wetlands have been connected with drainage work so they can be farmed through, and that water would all run off that land in the spring and make its way down into the natural part of the watershed and add those extra nutrients and sediments. He did highlight some real examples, looking at Fishing Lake and Waldsee Lake, which had major floods back in 2008. And both of those floods, Water Security had done assessments and found that drainage played a role in both of those floods by increasing the amount of water that flowed into those lakes. And just some of the costs to the people of Saskatchewan as well as the residents at that resort community. We're talking millions of dollars, and the need to construct and move cabins. In some cases, some people had to have their cabins destroyed and leave the lake altogether. And that the drainage portion that affected those lakes still remains unregulated, that those ditches still remain open and that they're still flowing into that lake system. He also touched on the auditor's report, which came out in 2021, which was critical of water security, and that currently they don't have any policies or regulations around wetland retention or water quality when they are approving drainage licenses. Secondly, that they need to enforce their legislation. They need to enforce the law when drainage happens illegally, which is what happens most of the time, as he pointed out. The other thing he mentioned was that the auditor mentioned was that they need to document these impacts. You know, draining just a few wetlands in itself isn't all that big an impact, but when it happens across the entire landscape or across a watershed, there's large-scale impacts which need to be taken into account. And then lastly, that they need to search out and police unapproved drainage, and especially in these high-risk areas where there's risk of flooding or nutrient loading. As I mentioned earlier, like he said, water security is currently promoting through their ag water management strategy drainage, draining responsibly, but they currently do not have any mitigation requirements. So there's no requirement to retain wetlands. There's no requirement to measure the amount of nutrients coming out of the drainage or to limit the amount of nutrients being sent downstream. And there's no enforcement when illegal drainage occurs. So that's Lake Water Wednesdays. That was sort of the highlight. So again, I encourage you to go through. I don't want to put words in people's mouths or give you kind of the Coles notes of some of those presentations. There's definitely a lot of good information in those webinars. So I would encourage you to go and watch them if you didn't see them when they were on the first time. And so then now I'll go into my presentation and just sort of talk a little bit about what we do with Ducks Unlimited and what I've been involved with. So many of you have probably heard about Ducks Unlimited. We've been around for quite a long time, since 1938 was when we were found. We are a Canadian company. We are a registered nonprofit charity, and we work to conserve wetlands and waterfowl habitat all across the country. And Saskatchewan, of course, is known for its ducks. And so it's no surprise that a lot of our effort here is spent in Saskatchewan. And over the years, we've worked with ranchers, farmers, landowners, cities, and even resort communities. You might be surprised that there's ducks projects near you or involved with your watershed. We're very proud of the fact that we are a science-based organization. That's how we started with the very first duck census in 1935. And we have our own research institute called Research Institute for Waterfowl and Wetlands Research. And so everything we do is guided by science. We rely on science to give us informed decisions about the programs we deliver and if they're working, if they're not. And so our programs are constantly changing with science. So then what is a wetland? Everyone uses the term wetland, marsh, swamp, slough. But it means a lot of different things to different people, and some would say, you know, well, that isn't a wetland, but this is. So the true definition that everyone sort of uses in the business is that to be a wetland, it has to have three things. It has to be saturated with water, the soil is generally poorly drained, and there's water-loving vegetation. If you have those three things, you have a wetland. And so you can see that wetlands exist in all kinds of types. So we have stuff that basically looks just like a puddle in the spring that dries up. You know, the birds use that usually first thing in time in the year. We also have more seasonal wetlands that still go dry, but they have lots of grass growing in them. And then you have your typical semi-permanent wetland with your cattails, and then your lakes and your more permanent wetlands. But they're all wetlands. The other thing that makes it even more challenging is that they change over time. You know, living in Saskatchewan, we know that if you wait long enough, the weather will change. And so we're going through a drought right now. We've also just came out of a very high wet period. So wetlands are quite dynamic, and they go from this dry to wet cycle quite frequently. So, you know, they don't always look the same. And even from year to year, here's the same wetland. you can see how it changes just based on moisture. The drier years, you get lots of vegetation, and then the wetter years, that water drowns out a lot of the plants, and so you end up with more of an open area. And those wetlands are also typically associated with other habitat types. So when we lose wetlands, we also tend to lose a lot of our native prairie, and there's not much of that left either. So what do wetlands do for you? Why should you even be concerned about wetlands in a resort community? Well, wetlands provide a lot of what they call ecological goods and services. So when we think of ecological goods, those are things like water and hay or food or wildlife. Those are the goods that we extract from the environment. The ecological services are those services that those same ecosystems provide, like water purification, erosion control, flood and drought control, biodiversity habitat, pollination. Those are the services that wetlands provide. And so, as I mentioned, they provide sources of water. Wetlands filter nutrients, so they catch those nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. They get trapped in the wetland, and then the plants in those wetlands use those nutrients up so that they don't flow downstream. They prevent flooding by storing that water and slowly releasing it, and they provide habitat for a great myriad of species. They also provide a lot of recreational opportunities, which is no surprise to, I think, most of everyone on this webinar. So why is it important to consider wetlands? Well, if we incorporate wetlands into our planning, into our decision making, we can protect those services that those wetlands provide us and ensure that they're maintained into the future. Wetlands are not water hazards. We commonly used to think of wetlands as something we had to get rid of. They were of no value. But as we've come to understand, they're tremendous value, and they provide us with a whole myriad of benefits. As I mentioned, biodiversity, they support a great number of wildlife species. A lot of species rely on wetlands for part or all of their life cycle. They're very important to our fisheries. They provide rearing areas and forage habitat, and they're important to our fishing is important to our economy, as well as waterfowling, hunting in Saskatchewan. 70% of all the ducks in the continent migrate through Saskatchewan. Hunting and fishing, as I mentioned, lots of revenue generation for this province, lots of benefits to our economy. Biodiversity, as I mentioned, providing everything from insects to large animals to birds. Almost half the birds in North America rely on wetlands. Pollinators, that's another thing that's known recently, is the importance of wetlands to pollinators, to crops, to wildflowers. Those insects that are beneficial to crops rely on the wetland habitat for their life cycle. So without those wetland habitats, we'll have less pollinators, and our crops will be less successful, or we'll have lesser yields. So, the importance of these odd areas, these small little wetlands across the landscape, are not only beneficial from an ecological goods perspective, they're also beneficial to producers and their farming operations. In the US, they estimate that pollinators have a benefit of about $57 billion per year. So we're not talking about something that's unsubstantial. And as one person with the Canola Council, an agronomist, said, just taking out a couple low spots in a field doesn't seem like much, but when it happens all across Canada, it is. Another thing wetlands do is they regulate climate. Wetlands store carbon. They are great carbon sinks. The carbon gets tied up in the soil, and so it stays there. They continually remove carbon from the atmosphere every year. And they play a big role in climate regulation because they do store carbon. It's estimated that they store 89 tons of carbon per hectare per year. 10 times the source of 10 times the total annual carbon emissions from all transportation in Canada. So big effect in terms of carbon sequestration and fighting climate change. So of course, when we drain a wetland, all that stored carbon is released, and it's not acting as a carbon sink anymore. It's not storing carbon anymore. So we lose that ecological service that wetlands provide for climate change. They're also very important for groundwater recharge. Those small little wet puddles that you see in the spring that dry up, they're very connected to the soil, and they're very closely linked to recharging our underwater groundwater supplies. And as I mentioned earlier, they help prevent floods and droughts. And they do this by trapping and holding water and then slowly releasing it. Water flows out of wetlands very slowly compared to just running off the landscape. And so you can kind of think of this as green infrastructure. Rather than building wetlands or building dams and dikes and expensive and structures that need to be maintained over the long term, these natural structures, this green infrastructure, provide all those benefits and more to us at very little cost. And why is that important in Saskatchewan? Well, in Saskatchewan, we rely heavily on spring runoff. We get a lot of snow over the winters usually, and that snow sits and accumulates over the winter months. And unlike other parts of the world, that snow all melts in the spring, and we get a deluge of water coming off the land or a runoff. And that accounts to about 80% of all the runoff we get in Saskatchewan. It's far more than the rain we get in the summertime. And so having wetlands on the landscape buffers against that runoff, that massive amount of water that we get moving across the landscape in the spring. And then again, wetlands filter into this. They build into this by filtering those nutrients as that water runs off the land. How do they remove contaminants from the water? Well, they do it through a number of processes. As I mentioned, it gets trapped in the sediments. There's organisms within the wetlands that use it, as well as the plants, and it gets built into the soil. I mean, that's why a lot of times when you look at a wetland, you see all the algae and all the plants, and it looks like a green, but you can think of it almost like a little bioreactor, using up all the nutrients that get trapped within it. And the amount of nutrients they use are substantial, so much so that in some places they actually use wetlands to treat their wastewater. Some of the sources of nutrients, as was mentioned in some of the other presentations, we have what they call point sources or non-point sources, and those point sources can include things like wastewater from towns, septic tanks, stormwater runoff, and then the non-point sources are the harder ones to really measure. You know, because there is no one thing that you can really point to. It happens over a much more broad area, such as agriculture and soil erosion on the landscape. I mentioned earlier that phosphorus is a big problem with runoff, and so this is a canola field, and in the spring, and you can see all that stubble, and the snow is melting, and so what you get is this freeze and thaw of the water on the crop. And what that does over time is it releases all that phosphorus that's there on the soil and the plants in the residue. And water or phosphorus is soluble in water. So that water that's laying on the land, when it starts to run off, it carries with it phosphorus. And so that's not something that, you know, is the fault of the ag producer. That's just the natural process that happens with spring runoff. But what happens or where that water goes, we can control. So if that water flows into a wetland where it can be used by, the nutrients can be used by the plants in the wetland, it's not a big deal. But if those nutrients run off in that water into a lake or stream, then there will be consequences downstream. This was just a copy of a slide that was from another presentation that the Lower Qu'Appelle watershed stewards gave with their nutrient study, showing basically the amount of phosphorus from municipalities and the amount of nitrogen from municipalities. And you can see the vast bulk of it was coming from non-point sources. And as I mentioned, other research that we've been involved with shows that basically the more drainage there is on the landscape, the greater the water yield, the more water flows downstream. And that means the more phosphorus and nitrogen are going to be flowing in those waters. So there's a very linear relationship. Basically, the more drainage, the more nutrient loading. And we know nutrient loading is a problem. It creates all kinds of bad things, such as algae blooms, toxic algae blooms, results in fish kills, you get odor and things from the water. So eutrophication of our lakes is not a desirable aspect, especially if you live in a resort community. You want your water to be as pristine as possible. And we're seeing some of those impacts with water quality. Probably the best known is Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg has gotten so green from nutrient loading and algae blooms that you can actually see how green it is from space. And it's impacting that lake in significant ways, not only to the people that live there, but also to their economy. We don't have to go all the way to Manitoba to see issues. We have them in our own backyard. This is the Qu'Appelle system again. As Alice mentioned, they're having some issues with nutrient loading in that Qu'Appelle system. And this was in the winter, or last fall, I should say, where they had a blue-green algae foam actually wash up on the shores in the Qu'Appelle Valley. So very much a concern to people. And I know if I lived in one of those homes along the lakeshore there, not something I would want to be looking out at on a regular basis. So there's lots of threats to wetlands, and I mentioned drainage is one of the big ones, obviously. But there's others such as pollution and climate change, invasive species, and just urban development. I mean, this problem is not limited to just agriculture and farmland drainage. We have all sorts of wetland loss happening in our cities and our towns. As we develop areas, we need space, and so wetlands are commonly converted to other uses. But when we move those wetlands, as I mentioned, we lose those ecological goods and services, and so we can replace them. So, for example, if we're not going to use the wetlands to remove nutrients, we can build water treatment plants, or if we're not going to use them to control flooding, we can build retention ponds. But all of those things come at an extra cost, and some of them are quite expensive, and they have to be maintained. So the cheaper and better option is always, or most often, to maintain that wetland and you realize those benefits that those wetlands provide. Just in terms of wetlands and legislation in this province, so unlike other forms of habitat or natural areas, wetlands are one of the few that have protection in this province. They are protected by the Water Security Act, as well as the Environmental Protection Act, and by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And the reason those acts all exist is because water belongs to the province. Even though people have water rights, water is a public resource. So you technically can't do anything to water unless you have an approval. So if you're going to, use that water for irrigation, you're going to use it for drinking, you're going to use it to, you're going to drain it to develop more agricultural land. That all requires an approval from the province. So water is a public resource. Even though people may say, well, those wetlands are on my land, I can decide what happens to them. They can and they can't. It is their land, but ultimately the water within those wetlands belongs to the people, and they have a say, or the province has a say in how that water is managed. Well, so why then, if we have this legislation and we have these levels of protection, are we continuing to see 70% or more wetland loss and ongoing wetland loss and drainage? And there's a number of factors at play here. Generally the government and society undervalue wetlands. The wetland policies and legislation that we have is inadequate, as I mentioned earlier, Saskatchewan doesn't have a wetland conservation policy. We have drainage policies, and those policies address some of the impacts that we experience when those wetlands are drained. Compliance and enforcement is inadequate. Water security just doesn't have enough staff to act on a lot of the complaints they get, and generally a lot of the stuff goes unenforced. There are incentives out there for producers to protect wetlands, but generally they're not enough, and not as much as some people may want. And there's all kinds of market signals encouraging development, whether it's in a city or out in a farm. There's all kinds of signals and economic benefits to converting wetlands to other uses, because the benefits are primarily for a society, not as for an individual. So, maintaining water quality doesn't really affect, say, the city itself or an individual farm. And those effects are all felt downstream. So what does drainage look like in Saskatchewan? Well, this is just an example of an area. This is an aerial photo taken in 1950 in the same area in 2000. And you can see that much of the landscape has been changed. A lot of the trees and bush have disappeared, and all those little black spots you see that are wetlands have all been drained away. So we've altered our landscape and our watershed substantially. And we lose currently in Saskatchewan about 28 acres of wetlands every day, the size of about 14 football fields. So it's very substantial. Here's another example here. This is the St. Gregor landscape up just by Humboldt, and this watershed would all flow into Last Mountain Lake. And you can see this is that watershed, part of that watershed in 1974. There was a very abundant amount of wetlands. You can see all the green there. And the red that you see, the little red lines, are drainage ditches. So there was a little bit of agricultural drainage at that time, but not much. Now here's the same area in 2002. So this is, almost 20 years ago now. And 90% of the wetlands had been drained by then. And I'm sure if you went back to the area now, it would be even higher in the last 20 years. So all that water's running off the land, carrying with it nutrients, and there's no mitigation in place to address that runoff. Another well-studied area is over in the Smith Creek watershed over by Yorkton in the Arma Church Bridge, and you can see sort of 1958 and on the left there, blue abundant wetlands on the landscape, and then here we are in 2009. And very few wetlands left, lots of red lines, lots of wetlands being drained. So Dr. John Pomeroy with the Global Water Institute at the University of Saskatchewan, they've done a lot of work on hydrology and understanding drainage and wetlands. And this was one of the studies that they did at Smith Creek. And you can see sort of the size, the watershed on the left and the watershed on the right, 1958 to 2009. And then they modeled sort of what would happen with that water as it ran off. And if you recall earlier in the presentation, Bob Halliday talked about, much of Saskatchewan doesn't contribute. Much of that water in Saskatchewan just stays on the land, it doesn't go anywhere. But what Dr. Pomeroy found was with all this drainage, it actually increased the contributing area. So more of the landscape was now running off and going downstream. And in this case, 384% increase in the amount of drainage. And then he also modeled sort of, well, what happens, in a dry year, a moderate year, or even a very wet year, and found that even in the wettest of years, during some of the flood years that area experienced, the volume of water and the flow of water coming off that landscape was about 30% higher than it should be naturally. And in the normal to dry years, it was anywhere from 200 to 300% higher. So it can have a very significant effect downstream. So I guess the take home from my presentation today is that if you enjoy the lake, if you enjoy having fun by the water, if you enjoy resort community living, there's probably wetlands you need to thank to do that. As I mentioned, there currently isn't an agricultural water management policy in place that mitigates for drainage for wetlands for the benefits that they provide. And so Ducks Unlimited, what we've been advocating for and encouraging others to advocate for is an open and transparent discussion. Far too often what we see is a lot of these policies and decisions made are done with select groups or with very small, limited consultation. The Ag Water Management Strategy, for example, came out as part of the 25-year water security plan. And I don't believe probably PARCS was even consulted in any of that, or even a lot of the resort communities or individuals didn't have really much of an opportunity to provide input into that. So encouraging more dialogue, encouraging more discussion, and having more people talk about what they want to see for water management in this province, I think is a good thing, and one of the things that we advocate for. The other thing that we really think is needed is mitigation. And mitigation is key to ensuring that when we do drain wetlands and we do develop wetlands, whether it be on farmland or in the city, that we account for those negative impacts, we measure them, and we basically try to do three things. Mitigation involves either avoiding those impacts if you can, minimizing them wherever you can, and if you can't do either avoid or minimize, that you compensate for those. And so mitigation is key. Having a well-defined mitigation process allows everyone to understand, how to develop wetlands if they're going to develop them, the things they need to think about when they do that. It clearly defines what's required in terms of what we want to have as an environmental outcome. And then it empowers the people that are doing the development to come up with solutions of their own that they can achieve those goals and objectives or even surpass them. And mitigation is not new to Saskatchewan. Ducks has been working with on mitigation for a number of years. We work very closely with some of the industries like oil and mining and railway lines, and also Ministry of Highways. And we've restored hundreds of wetlands under a mitigation sequence. Unfortunately, it's not required. There's no legislation that requires it. It's totally voluntary at this point. And so as you can imagine, most of the wetland development that takes place doesn't do so with mitigation. So as I mentioned, a lot of what's being happening is being done voluntarily. And ideally what you want to have is this upside down pyramid, so that what we're seeing is, you start with avoiding the development altogether if you can. Maybe move the development somewhere else. Maybe that land isn't suited for the development you're planning. I know not all farmland drainage is productive and economical. Not all the land can make a good return on crop production. So maybe you're best to avoid draining that wetland to try to bring it into crop production. Or maybe there's things you can do to minimize it. But the last thing you want to do is if all else fails, be in a replacement mode. But that shouldn't be the number one thing that you're doing. And again, just sort of reiterating that protecting wetlands and the services they provide isn't anti-development. It's smart development. It's about protecting those benefits that they provide and resulting in a better quality of life. As I mentioned, mitigation has been very successful, and we have restored a lot of wetlands. Here's just an example of work that was done with Ministry of Highways. If you've ever driven around the Louvain Exchange there on the south end of Regina, they mitigated for all the drainage that they did. They drained about a number of acres of wetlands, and as a result, they had to restore 30 acres, or they agreed to restore 30 hectares or 74 acres of wetlands in another part of that watershed. So those benefits that those wetlands provided were protected and created elsewhere in the landscape. Similar, the Regina bypass did the same thing. They restored 247 hectares of wetlands. And restoring wetlands is actually quite simple. It's just a matter of finding a drainage ditch somewhere and putting an earth plug. And in no time, as soon as the water returns back to the land, that wetland will reflood and recharge and start providing all those benefits that it did when it was still intact. So then just to close off, I'll add that, we can't control the rain and the snow, but we can control wetland loss and all the unintended consequences and impacts that brings. And so with that, I will end my presentation. And if anyone has any questions, you can type them in the question box or simply raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask your question. So thanks again for the opportunity and for your time, and for Parks for asking me to give this presentation. Okay, so I'm just looking at the questions here. So Orly asked, do you think those super blooms of blue-green algae, are they now affecting our air quality? Do you know of anyone testing for that? I'm not aware of anyone that's testing air quality due to the algae blooms. I know in some cases, yeah, there is a smell. That would be a question probably best for Dr. Peter Levitt. Another question here in Dr. Peter Levitt's oops, sorry. Okay, sorry. I have to make my screen bigger here. Okay, so when it comes to protecting and preserving wetland areas, is it better to do so in a concentrated fashion, i.e. one large wetland in an RM, or if done on a more distributed basis, say per section of land? So yeah, that's a good question. So there is this thought that you can consolidate, say, wetlands drainage into one larger wetland. And as you saw in some of those earlier slides, wetlands exist in a whole variety of sort of shapes and sizes. Some are very shallow, some are very deep, and all those various characteristics have different benefits. So there's really no one size fits all. So the idea that, one big wetland is better than a bunch of small wetlands really doesn't hold true when you look at the services that they provide and the habitat types they provide. So if you did that, basically you are going to remove a whole bunch of those habitat types or services, because larger wetlands, deeper wetlands provide different services than those shallow, more ephemeral wetlands. So there's no one size fits all. There's no one ideal marsh that does everything. So ideally, yeah, what you want is a variety of wetlands across the landscape, providing a variety of functions. So when it comes to preserving and increasing wetland areas, oh, no, sorry, I just read that one. How close do you think water security is at getting a wetland policy in place? So they have been working on it for a number of years. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of complex discussions going on. I can't speak to how soon water security will announce it. We do know that they have said that they plan to have one in 3 years. But we've also had them say that, we would have had one by now. So it is a very complex issue, if I can say that. And ultimately, they're the ones that decide. They're the ones that are going to set a policy, if they're going to set a policy. And you know, as you can imagine, there are individuals that want to see protection, and there are individuals that don't want to see protection. There are individuals that think we should be draining more of this province and developing more of our land for cities and for agriculture. And there's others that say, no, we should be working with nature. So yeah, it is going to take some time. But I can say that the science is there. This really isn't a science discussion. This isn't about, well, do wetlands provide benefits? Do wetlands sequester carbon? Do they filter nutrients? Those discussions have all been had, and the science is there to prove it. Really what we are now in is a political discussion, is, you know, what do we value? What do we want to see? How do we want our landscape to look? How do we want our province to look? What quality of life do we want to have in this province? That's more the discussion that's taking place now, I think, with the wetland policy work and protection. It's not to do with whether or not protecting wetlands has benefits. It's more of a political discussion. So somebody asked, can you describe the government's approach to resolving drainage issues and the request for assistance? So yeah, in this province, because we have laws regarding agricultural drainage, if you see agricultural drainage, you can file a complaint, or if you're impacted by agricultural drainage, you can file a complaint with the Water Security Agency. And unfortunately, the system is not ideal, unlike other systems, say with the Ministry of Environment. The process basically requires water security reports or contacts the violator and says, Mr. or Mrs. X called us and we're here to investigate. So right off the bat, it creates a lot of conflict. It's not anonymous. And the whole intent of the complaint process is to try and resolve the complaint. It's not to address the impacts necessarily, you know, or because there is no mitigation guidelines, it's not to mitigate for those impacts. It's basically to come up with a solution so that they can license the drainage ideally and ensure that both parties are okay with that. So there is a lot of work, I think, that needs to take place on the complaint side. And to be honest, the legislation doesn't require a complaint for water security to enforce the law. So placing people in that complaint process is not a good system, especially if you live in a small town. You know, these are the same people that are your neighbors, people that you see in the grocery store that you may work with. You know, they might even be family members. And so nobody wants to be in a conflict situation where you're having to, you know, call the Water Security Agency to complain about somebody that you know. So hopefully that's something else that gets resolved, is the complaint process itself. Another question, does Ducks Unlimited seed the land they acquire around wetland areas, and what grasses do we use? Are there projects, upcoming drought or wet areas considered when seeding these grasses? So yeah, so any land that we work with when we restore wetlands, in some cases, we haven't done it a great deal, but we do actually seed some of the wetland plants back. And then if we have an agreement around the surrounding land on the uplands, yes, we will seed it to native grasses or forages, depending on who owns the land, if it's being managed for, say, cattle or for waterfowl habitat, nesting habitat. We do a number of those things. So yes, and we also have another company that we actually created, because we were one of the first ones to start seeding native grasses and restoring wetlands using native plants. And you just can't go anywhere and say, well, I need, you know, a couple 100 pounds of cattail seed, because it's just not available. So because we had that need, we quite quickly started developing our own seed sources, and eventually that process led to the development of a separate company called Native Plant Solutions. And so there's a separate company from that Ducks Unlimited helped start and they're a for-profit business, and yeah, they go out and they work with communities and cities and towns if they're doing native restorations and developments and whatnot. So yes, we do reseed a lot of things. Another question: how do shelter belts relate to wetlands? Thinking here of the trees being planted PFRA. So wetlands, like shelter belts, when you think of all that snow that's accumulating over the winter, tends to blow everywhere, doesn't sit on the land. And so that's what shelter belts are meant to do. Shelter belts are meant to trap that snow, slow down the wind and prevent soil erosion. Well, wetlands do the same thing. And so if you look at those wetlands in the spring, usually they're overflowing with snow. You know, the snow will be as deep as the top of the cattails. And so when that water melts, it goes right into the wetland. So it's, you know, it's acting as that another service that it provides is sort of that flood control. There's another question here about Dr. Levitt's presentation and biomarkers. Unfortunately, I don't know where that information is. That was part of Dr. Levitt's presentation, so I would suggest you reach out to him or watch his presentation. He might have that information. Okay, let's see, I'm just going to look and see. Oh, Brian has his hand up. Brian, I'm going to unmute you there if you have a question.
Yeah, I was listening to your presentation here this morning, and it seems like, and I really appreciate that you're science-based. I really appreciate that. We're at the Stony Lake out by Humboldt right now, and we've put together a very technical case against, you know, encouraging the city of Humboldt to really reconsider their intention to continue to discharge the effluent to Humboldt Lake for the next 30+ years as the city grows to 10,000 people. And our research shows that in many cases, the percentage of discharge of nutrient load into the lake is every bit as big from the effluent-based community as it is from the agricultural community, and your science doesn't seem to support that. We got about 900 pages of information we've researched so far that continues to assert that, and I was just wondering, you know, did I miss something, or did you?
No, I think you're bang on there. What I was referring to was the nutrient study that the Lower Qu'Appelle watershed stewards did with Water Security Agency and Global Water Security out of U of S. So that is their case, that the majority of the nutrients are coming in runoff. In your case, it's obviously different. So I think we can't make the generalization that all nutrient loading in this province is from runoff, and that, you know, cities and towns haven't played a role or aren't a major contributor. You need to look specifically at your watershed or your resort village or your area and do that measurement. And that speaks volumes to the fact that, you know, we don't have an awful lot of measurements that are taking place. You know, there are some stations in the province where water quality is measured, but there's lots that aren't. You know, in a lot of these major drainage projects that have been approved over the years, no one measured water quality coming out of these systems. You know, there are guidelines for wastewater treatment plants, but as we saw, like with City of Regina, you know, those were being exceeded, and that's why they needed to upgrade the facility. So yeah, you can't. I didn't mean to give the impression that, you know, it's all runoff and cities are not part of the problem. It depends where you are.
Yeah, I just as a corollary that I don't mean to monopolize this, but you know, the science 5 years after the city of Regina put that wastewater treatment plant in is there's still no measurable positive impact to the waterways downstream of that. And I think that just speaks to the relevance of that whole discussion. And the other thing too is that we've interfaced and worked really hard, you know, to get the related government organizations excited about participating in the demise of our lake. You know, we found a general reluctance from the WSA, which is nobody's surprise, but also a general reluctance in the watershed. So we have this larger Qu'Appelle watershed, and we have the smaller Lanigan Creek Delwood Brook, and there just is a real reluctance to even recognize that agriculture has a role to play, and certainly a reluctance of both of those organizations, or all three of them, to actually contribute positively to anything, recognizing that some of those solutions really aren't that expensive, and it's a journey, not a destination. And I just wanted to hear what your comments and thoughts on that are.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, right? Sorry, I've lost my train of thought here. Can you repeat that just one more time?
What I said is that we've worked really hard over the last year with the WSA and the watersheds, and there's just a general reluctance for any of them to get involved. Like, what do you do for a living, if I want to be crass? You know?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's, you know, that speaks similarly to the question about the, you know, why we don't have a wetland protection policy. Is, you know, this is you know, when you think of our history, you know, we've gone from a sort of a very strong development mode that, you know, we need to sort of take over nature, clear nature, get nature out of the way, and develop, you know, whether it's bringing land into production or making our cities more larger, all that. But we're starting to realize that, you know, we need to work with nature, not against it. And, you know, it's going to take time for people to sort of have that mindset and to think about that when they start talking about development. And so, yeah, you know, it's difficult, and it's costly too, right? Because the things we put in place, as I pointed out, you know, so, you know, having a water treatment plant versus keeping some wetlands around, one is more costly than the other. And when you start talking about changing how people think, and maybe we should do this differently, or, oh, this is now a major source of nutrients, you're going to have to spend, you know, millions of dollars to fix it. People aren't real, you know, are a little reluctant to say, oh yeah, well, let's just do that, you know. So yeah, I totally agree. So anyways, I will cut you off there, Brian, to see if anybody else has any questions. Alice, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something, Alice? Alice, you're self-muted. If you can unmute your microphone.
Well, sorry about that.
Hey, Alice.
I just wanted, how are you? Great presentation, Chuck. I had written my question as well, but what are your thoughts on once the Lake Diefenbaker project starts? Do you see wetlands being lost, or more wetlands on the ground?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So as Jeff alluded to in his webinar, and as I mentioned when I was highlighting his presentation, so currently under the guidelines developed by Water Security, there really is no mitigation for wetland loss. If you want to drain wetlands, as long as you're doing it responsibly, there's no limit to how much you can drain. So one concern we would have as Ducks Unlimited is with that policy in place, and the government potentially spending billions of dollars to develop irrigation for croplands that have wetlands on them, and parts of that watershed do, you know, what mechanisms are going to be in place to ensure that those wetlands are protected, or if they're going to be converted to cropland, is there going to be mitigation like we saw with, you know, Ministry of Highways or some of the potash mines, things like that? Because as long as there's mitigation, development can occur, you know, as long as it's done responsibly and those benefits are maintained. So, I mean, I don't want to give anybody the impression that Ducks Unlimited Canada is anti-drainage. It's about, you know, doing things responsibly and managing wetlands so that the benefits are maintained. And in some cases that means, yeah, you shouldn't drain, but in other cases, you know, if the impacts can be mitigated for. So the fact that we don't have these protection measures in place, the fact that, you know, it's up to the individual producers to get a license from Water Security to drain their land, and really no public consultation, yeah, there could be potentially more wetlands lost in that landscape, you know, because people are going to spend a lot of money to bring this land into irrigation, and they're going to want to make sure that they maximize every acre of land they have within those watersheds. And it's not going to be limited to just wetlands. It'll be any native area that's in those areas.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's hope some sort of mitigation policy comes into effect while they're developing policies to bring this project on.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Alice. Any more questions? That looks like it. There's one more question here. Where are we here? Sorry. I've heard that some farmers are not happy with Ducks Unlimited Canada. Do you know why? Yeah, as you can imagine, Ducks Unlimited, we've been around since 1938, and we pride ourselves on being very pro-agriculture and working with agricultural producers. But I've often heard it said that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. And so there are producers, unfortunately, that don't see value in wetlands or don't believe that we need to protect wetlands. And as part of that, you know, they see organizations like ourselves and even the Water Security Agency, for that matter, as, you know, not an organization that they believe in or that they trust. And so that's why some producers don't feel that, you know, they don't like Ducks Unlimited. They don't. They feel that, you know, that ducks shouldn't be promoting wetland conservation. And I mean, that's their right. Everyone has an opinion. And in some cases, it's channeled at ducks because we are basically the only organization out there, private nonprofit organization out there that speaks for wetlands. And so we tend to get a lot of the negative focus when wetlands are mentioned, that, you know, somehow Ducks Unlimited is to blame for this, or there's some other motive involved. So yeah, it happens, unfortunately, but I can tell you we have very good working relationships with agriculture industry. We're seen as the go-to agency in this country for wetland information and research, and we're very proud of our history and our continued history working with agricultural producers, because they are the stewards of the land. They are the ones that are in control of wetlands for the most part in this province and in the country. And without them, there will not be conservation. So they are very important to this whole process and in the decision making going forward. One last question, sorry, came in here. To the theme of the webinar, what can individual cottage cabin owners do to improve conditions given the connections to the lake, landscaping, sewage? So yeah, so Alice's presentation, if you haven't seen it, you can watch it. I would encourage you to watch it. She talks about community living on the lakeshore and things you can do to improve the lakeshore, you know, in terms of making sure your septic tank is well maintained and the natural vegetation buffers along the shoreline. But it's also worth noting sort of where you are in the watershed. You know, what influences your lake? Are you receiving your water in your lake community from other sources? Is it, you know, is there fed by a river or a creek? What influences that water quality? So you just need to be aware and understand how you fit into the watershed and be active. Like I said earlier, I don't think many people have been consulted on these new water policies, and so there's an opportunity for you to get involved and to work with a number of organizations like PARCS or Ducks Unlimited or any of the other previous groups that gave webinars.
Yeah,
so that,
Chuck, I don't know if you can hear me. It's Gary Dixon.
Go ahead, Gary.
I think I appreciate all the questions being